Welcome back. To understand the story we are discussing today, you have to imagine a silence so profound it has echoed for over 400 years. Imagine a thriving village full of life, laughter, and the sounds of industry. Now, imagine blinking your eyes, and in an instant, it is all gone. This isn't fiction. This is the ghost story of history. We are traveling back to the late 1500s, to a small strip of land off the coast of North Carolina. Here, on Roanoke Island, one of the most baffling disappearances in human record took place. 115 people, men, women, and children, simply vanished. They left behind no bodies. They left behind no witnesses. They simply stepped off the edge of the known world and into legend. Today, we are going to walk in their footsteps to answer the question, how did they disappear? To understand the tragedy of Roanoke, we must first understand the desperation of the era. This was the age of exploration, a time when the map of the world was being redrawn in gunpowder and blood. In the 16th century, Europe was starving for resources. They hungered for land, and more importantly, they hungered for gold. But there was one problem for the English: Spain. Spain was the supreme colonial superpower of the day. They dominated the Americas, their ships flowing back to Europe, heavy with stolen Incan and Aztec silver. England? England was late to the imperial game. They were the underdogs, looking across the channel with envy. They were motivated not just by discovery, but by a need to challenge this Spanish dominance. They needed a foothold. They needed to discover untold riches in the New World to survive as a nation. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Enter Sir Walter Raleigh. If you look at the portraits from the time, he is the epitome of the Elizabethan courtier. Confident, well-dressed, and dangerously ambitious. He was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, a man who knew how to charm his way into power. Raleigh had a dream. He secured a royal charter from the Queen herself. This piece of parchment gave him the legal right to colonize vast territories in North America. But here is the irony. Despite his name being forever linked to this expedition, Raleigh himself never voyaged to Roanoke. He was the mastermind, the financier. His goal was audacious. He didn't just want a farm. He wanted a strategic military base. He wanted a pirate's cove, essentially, a place to launch attacks upon those massive Spanish treasure ships crossing the Atlantic waters. Roanoke was meant to be a weapon against Spain. Before the tragedy, there was the sales pitch. In 1584, Raleigh sent a scouting mission led by Amadas and Barlow. They arrived in what is now the Outer Banks and thought they had found Eden. They laid claim to the land, naming it Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. During this trip, they made first contact with the indigenous peoples of the region, the Secotan and the Croatoan. The captains returned to England with stars in their eyes. Their reports were enthusiastic, proclaiming this land to be an earthly paradise. They spoke of fertile soil, abundant game, and friendly locals. These reports set the stage for England's colonial ambitions. They sold the dream of an easy life, a paradise waiting to be plucked. They had no idea how wrong they were. The dream of paradise led to the first real attempt at colonization in 1585. But look at who they sent. This wasn't a group of farmers or families. This was a military operation. Ralph Lane led a group of 108 men. These were soldiers and scientists. There were no families, no women, no children. Their mission was to construct a military fort on Roanoke Island. And you can see the military influence in the archaeology, the star-shaped forts designed for defense. But they made a fatal miscalculation before they even finished the walls. They arrived too late in the planting season. The soldiers knew how to fight, but they didn't know how to forage or farm in this alien environment. Their survival depended entirely upon native assistance. They were invaders who needed their hosts to feed them. Reliance turned to resentment very quickly. As the Englishmen grew hungry, they became aggressive. There was trouble brewing in paradise. The English colonists relied desperately upon Native Americans for sustenance, but cultural misunderstandings escalated. The English viewed the lack of food as hostility. The natives viewed the English demands as theft. Small skirmishes escalated into deadly conflict. The breaking point came with a brutal act of violence. The English forces turned on the local leader, Chief Wingina. In a preemptive strike, they murdered him. This was the moment the dream died. Wingina's murder shattered trust irreparably. Before the colony could truly establish roots, they had made enemies of the very people who held the keys to their survival. By 1586, the soldiers on Roanoke were starving and terrified. Then, a miracle appeared on the horizon. Sir Francis Drake, the legendary privateer, arrived unexpectedly. He found the colonists in a pitiful state, starving and fearful. They had had enough. When Drake offered them passage home, they didn't hesitate. They eagerly abandoned the settlement. The fort was emptied, but not entirely. In a decision that chills the blood, a small detachment was left behind. 15 brave men were tasked with holding the fort in the wilderness. Their orders were to protect England's claim against impossible odds. As Drake's ships disappeared over the horizon, these 15 men stood alone, surrounded by the enemies their predecessors had created. You would think, after such a failure, England would give up. But the allure of the New World was too strong. In 1587, a second attempt was launched. This time, the strategy was revolutionary. The leader was John White, not a soldier, but an artist. And look at the passenger list, 115 colonists. But this time, it included women and children. This changes everything. This wasn't a raid. This was a migration. Their mission was ambitious, to establish a permanent community. They wanted a thriving settlement, not merely another military outpost. They packed for a lifetime. They were going there to live and to die in their new home. The plan was actually to settle further north, in the Chesapeake Bay, avoiding the bad blood of Roanoke. But through a series of mishaps and a stubborn pilot, they were dumped back at Roanoke Island in July 1587. The arrival was a nightmare. They walked up to the site of the old military fort and found it utterly destroyed. The walls were reclaimed by nature. Vines were choking the ramparts, and the 15 men left behind by Drake, gone. The only trace of them was a single skeleton marking their fate. It was a chilling realization for the families standing on that beach. They realized they stood alone in hostile territory. They had no allies, no shelter, and after seeing that skeleton, no certainty of survival. John White knew they were in danger. He desperately sought reconciliation with the local tribes. He tried to mend fences, but the damage done by Ralph Lane years earlier was deep. His one hope lay with the Croatoan tribe, led by Manteo. Manteo had traveled to England. He knew the English ways and remained a friendly ally. In a ceremony of great hope, Manteo was baptized and even proclaimed the Lord of Roanoke. But Manteo's friendship could only do so much. The Secotan people, neighbors to the colony, nursed bitter anger from the past English violence. The colonists were living in a tiny bubble of safety, surrounded by a forest of eyes that did not forget. Amidst the fear and the rebuilding, a moment of pure light occurred. On August 18th, 1587, a child was born. She was John White's own granddaughter. They named her Virginia Dare. She holds a monumental place in history as the first English child born in the New World. Think of what her birth represented. It symbolized hope. It symbolized permanence. It meant that the English were not just visitors anymore. They were growing from the soil itself. Yet, whenever we hear her name today, it brings a sense of sadness. Her fate would become history's haunting mystery. The first life of the new colony would become its most famous ghost. Joy was short-lived. Reality set in. The supplies were dwindling rapidly. The colony realized they could not survive the coming winter without help from home. The desperate colonists begged John White to return to England. They needed an advocate, someone the Queen would listen to. They made him promise to return within 3 months. The agony of that decision. To save his family, he had to leave them. He sailed away, leaving behind his beloved daughter and his infant granddaughter, Virginia. As the ship pulled away, he likely told himself it was only for a short time. He never imagined the agonizing years that lay ahead. John White made it back to England, but he walked straight into a geopolitical firestorm. War had erupted between England and Spain. The formidable Spanish Armada was approaching, the greatest invasion fleet Europe had ever seen. England was fighting for its very existence. In this emergency, Queen Elizabeth ordered the seizure of all ships. Every vessel that could float was needed for the defense of the realm. Roanoke was forgotten. John White remained trapped in England for 3 agonizing years. 3 years of looking at the ocean. 3 years of wondering if his granddaughter was walking or talking, or if she was even alive. His family faced unknown horrors across the Atlantic, and he was powerless to reach them. Finally, in 1590, the war subsided enough for White to move. He secured passage on a privateer ship. The journey was cursed from the start. They arrived off the coast of the Outer Banks during hurricane season, and in a twist of fate that feels scripted by a tragedian, they arrived precisely on Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. Through the rough seas and the driving rain, the sailors spotted smoke rising from the island. Hearts raced with hope. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. White must have thought, they are alive. They are cooking dinner. But as they fought through the surf to reach the source, hope collapsed. It was merely a forest fire. No signal. No welcome. White and his search party stepped onto the shore. The silence must have been deafening. They entered the settlement. But what they found was strange. It wasn't a scene of a massacre. There were no bodies, no blood, no burnt ruins. Instead, the settlement had been methodically dismantled. The houses hadn't been destroyed. They had been carefully taken down, piece by piece. They found a newly constructed defensive palisade wall. This is a crucial detail. It suggested a planned departure rather than a panicked flight or a violent catastrophe. They didn't run away. They packed up and moved. White looked for a sign. Before he left 3 years prior, they had agreed on a secret code. If the colonists were forced to leave under distress, if they were being attacked, they were to carve a Maltese cross into a tree. White found the carvings. On a tree, the letters CRO. On a fence post, the full word, Croatoan. White stared at the wood. Crucially absent was the Maltese cross. There was no distress signal. The message seemed clear. The colonists had departed voluntarily, and they had left an address. They had gone to Croatoan. This brings us to the first, and perhaps most logical theory, the Croatoan move. Croatoan, now known as Hatteras Island, was the home of Manteo, their friend and ally. The carved message directly suggested they had relocated there. It makes sense. If you are starving and waiting for a ship that never comes, you go to your friends. Compelling evidence has emerged over the centuries to support this. Later generations of explorers reported finding Hatteras natives who possessed gray or blue eyes and spoke English words that were unknown elsewhere in North America. It suggests that the colonists didn't vanish. They assimilated. They survived by becoming part of the very people they once relied upon. But there is another possibility. Theory number 2, integration inland. Some historians believe the group may have split up. Perhaps one group journeyed inland to join the Roanoke tribe. Years later, settlers in these inland areas reported rumors of mysterious houses of stone, architecture that sounded distinctly English. Then there are the artifacts. English coins, signet rings, and tools have been discovered far inland, and we have to mention the controversial Dare stones, stones carved with messages allegedly from the survivors. While many are hoaxes, some believe the first stone could be genuine, telling a tale of survival and movement into the deep interior. Of course, history is rarely without violence. We must consider Theory 3, tragedy at sea or war. Did the desperate colonists try to sail home in the small pinnace boat they had left? Did they perish in the Atlantic? Or did the Spanish, determined to eliminate English rivals, find them and finish the job? There is also a chilling confession from the native history of Virginia. Chief Powhatan, the father of the famous Pocahontas, reportedly told Captain John Smith years later that he had annihilated a group of people. He claimed to have wiped out people matching the colonists. We may never know for sure. The weather forced John White to leave in 1590 before he could investigate Hatteras. He died never knowing the fate of his family. But Roanoke was not a total loss. Its haunting failure taught England invaluable lessons. It paved the way for Jamestown's success 17 years later, built on the hard-won wisdom of those who vanished. Today, Roanoke remains America's oldest unsolved mystery. It endures because it frightens us, but also because it fascinates us. It reminds us that history is not always written in stone. Sometimes it is carved in wood, left as a riddle. The greatest power of history lies within these unanswered questions that captivate our imaginations eternally. Thank you for watching.